Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session. My name is Sandras Phiri. I am the CEO and founder of Pranary, and Pranary is a practical business school for entrepreneurs in Africa. We help entrepreneurs to grow their businesses as well as to learn how to raise money, and we put them in front of investors. And so every month we host fireside chats with people who've done it before. And so entrepreneurs like Mark Coopersmith, who is also an investor, is also a professor at UC Berkeley. It's somebody who teaches what he knows and practices what he preaches, which is super, super cool. And it's so good to see so many people from across Africa, people from Accra, Ghana, from Joburg, South Africa, from Gaborone, Botswana, Lusaka, Zambia, from Nairobi, Kenya, Dar es Salaam. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited. To tell you a little bit about Mark. Mark is a Fortune 500 global executive and Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He has spent 3 decades launching, building, and fixing high-growth organizations, ranging from raw startups to launching new divisions of multinational corporations, such as Sony. And his e-commerce payment startup, WebOrder, is now owned by Google. So we're so privileged and so happy to have Mark. He speaks around the world teaching the different aspects of entrepreneurship, but the most important piece is really just how to bring all the different lessons that he has learned by practicing, but also working with the Silicon Valley founders, as well as interviewing lots of different people, finding out what are the common traits that they all share and what can we learn from them. And most importantly, what would be the one common trait that they all share? So I'm so happy to have Mark here. Mark, thank you very much for joining us so early.
Well, it's not too early here, but it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to join you, Sandras. It's a pleasure to join all of you that are tuning in as well.
Fantastic. Could you just tell us a little bit about your work and your background before we get into the main points of today?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the fantastic introduction and a little bit of the context. I guess I would simplify from a background standpoint and what I do in kind of 2 or 3 buckets. Number one, like many of you, I started out my career as a corporate entrepreneur and an entrepreneur. And for 30 years, every day I got up and I went out and I did it. I had some nice successes along the way. I had a few failures along the way. We'll talk about failure later because we can learn from it. You know, the more change you try and drive, you'll run into setbacks along the way. So I've done this. And after one success and one failure, I went back to my academic institution, UC Berkeley, where I have several degrees. And I said, I studied entrepreneurship here, but I think there's some things you didn't teach me. So for the last 20 years, in addition to my work as an entrepreneur and an investor, I've been kind of trying to turn over the rocks and say, here are some of the ugly little facts of being an entrepreneur. Here are some of the problems. Here's where you skin your knees. And I focus on the fun stuff, right, building, but also on some of the challenges that you have, especially as entrepreneurs, as leaders, as change makers, as innovators in your organizations, whether they're 2-person operations or whether you're inside a big global enterprise trying to make change happen. And one last thing, I guess, if I were to characterize my personal vision, kind of my meaning, my mantra, it is to help make positive change happen. And I think about that in each of us as an individual. How can we be better at driving positive change? I think about that on the team level. How can we operate better as teams to make that happen on the company level? And one of the things that I particularly am focused on is kind of societally, environmentally. So in addition to entrepreneurship, I also actively teach and work on and kind of create new content around social entrepreneurship and creating sustainable social ventures and sustainable in that fundamental way of financially sustainable. So those are just a few pieces of background around me.
Fantastic. Great. And then tell us a little bit about your startups. Like, what was the experience like, but more from the growth point of view?
Yeah. Perfect. So I'll provide just a touch of context. I've always been entrepreneurial, but I almost found myself as an accidental entrepreneur the first time I launched my very first startup. I was working, my first corporate entrepreneurship experiences were at Sony, where I worked across all of the different divisions of this global, this multinational company. And this was earlier in my career. So I'll date myself. This was in the 1990s. And the internet was just starting to happen. So I'd founded this division with a couple of colleagues. That was my corporate entrepreneurship component. We built this business to $150 million or so in revenues over 4 or 5 years. So the growth stage is really fun. I'm going to come back to that. And then this thing called the internet started happening, things we take for granted. For me, I've seen it since inception. For many of you who are watching, it's probably something that, you're a digital native. But I ended up running e-commerce and payments for Sony on a global basis. We had to figure out how to sell our products online. Amazon didn't exist then. So I ended up not liking the solutions that were out there to accept credit cards over the web, right, over the internet at that time. Now, I happen to be located in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley. So I pulled together some engineering friends of mine and I said, can we build a better payments platform? And we did. And this was inside Sony. And all of a sudden, a lot of companies started coming to me and asking me, well, what's that payment platform you have? It's way better than the ones we paid $1 million for over here, or we're paying $100,000 a month for over there. And I said, well, I built it. And they said, well, can we use it too? That was my aha moment to be an entrepreneur. I went back to my bosses at Sony and I said, we should be in the e-commerce business and sell payment platforms. And they go, no, we're not in the e-commerce business. And I said, well, can I take this piece of technology that I built with this team out from Sony? And to my surprise, they said yes. I had to give them a license to use the technology in perpetuity with no fees, but that was easy. So I spun it out of Sony, and all of a sudden, there I was with just a few of us as an entrepreneur without any money to run my business with. So I went out, that was my entrepreneurial aha moment, but I knew I had customers. So I went out and raised capital, figured out what I needed to do from the standpoint of creating an entity and raising capital and building a team and learning about the technology, because all of a sudden now I had to pitch it to investors. And we took that through rapid funding and growth, and we ended up getting acquired by another public company that then was bought by Google. So that was my first startup story. And there are 1 or 2 things I want to touch on there, and then Sandras, back to you. This element of product market fit that we hear a lot about is so important, and it's hard to find. But in this instance, I was actually the customer, right? I was a corporate that needed a payment platform. So I built something to meet my needs. And it turned out there were a lot of other people like me. So as soon as they saw it, they said, this is way better. Whoever built this understands my pain. I was like them. I knew many of them from conferences and things like that. So they came to me and said it. So understanding the market that you're in, sometimes I call it scratching your own itch, provides that inspiration because you know what works and what doesn't work. You know what the hole in the marketplace is. When you go looking for a solution and you think that the ones that are out there suck, then maybe that's where the opportunity exists. Sandras?
Fantastic. And so you've moved on now, you are even making investments. Tell us about what you look for in the companies that you invest in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll share a little bit about that. And Sandras, when we're done here, I'm keeping a list, and I'm going to share a few videos as well, because in my teaching at UC Berkeley, I interview friends and colleagues. And one of the sets of interviews I did recently are with is with a colleague of mine. I'm an investor in his fund. That's a longtime venture capitalist as well. And we have videos where we discuss how does venture capital work and what do VCs look for in an investment. So we're not going to go into how the VC works side, but if anybody's interested in some more info on that, we'll talk with Jed at Javelin Ventures.
Fantastic.
So, my entree.
That. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm jotting it down, and please do as well, so I can share that. And by way of follow-up, there's a few things we can share too. So my entree as an investor started quite early, and again, somewhat accidental, because when I spun that piece of technology out, it became a company called WebOrder that Google now owns. When I spun that technology out, I immediately had to find some funding for it. And when I woke up in the morning and I looked at myself as I was shaving, I said, who's going to invest in this company? I knew I was looking at my first investor, and that was me. So the place to start, of course, is you've got to be so confident in that vision that becomes your first investor. Sometimes there's friends and family, which we often turn to. But one of my attitudes around friends and family is never take money from friends or family that they can't afford to lose. I can imagine here in America, for example, sitting around the Thanksgiving table, right, which is our annual, dinner where all the family comes together, and having lost Aunt Mary's retirement money. So I'm always very cautious about that. But when it comes to investing, when I spun this out, I invested myself. And then my first round of funding, I worked with a angel investor named Guy Kawasaki. You may know Guy. He's kind of an evangelist and a startup guru. And I was the very first company that actually raised money through his angel network called Garage.com. So I was fortunate to be there kind of at the start of much of this. This was in the late 1990s. And I got to know many angels, and I started to understand how they invest, what they look for. And it's interesting, angels and venture capitalists often look for slightly different things. So when you invest as an angel, or when you're looking for an angel, as an angel investor, I look for somebody I really like, because I'm going to give them my money and trust them. I look for somebody that I feel I can make introductions to and for with my network. Somebody that I don't mind hanging out with a bit. Yes, it's absolutely a financial decision, but it's also a personal decision, and I'm going to do what I can to help them. So my first effort as an investor was also as an angel investor, where after I'd had my first sale, I started making small investments when I sold in people and companies I liked. And then I ran into a problem, because I also teach entrepreneurship at UC Berkeley. I started doing that 20 years ago. And I encourage all of my students to think about ventures they would like to start. Now, sometimes they start them up in my class, which is great, or sometimes they start them up afterwards. And invariably, they would come back to me and say, Professor Mark, will you invest in my startup? You encouraged me to do this. Now, one of the unfortunate elements of startups, as many of us know, is more startups fail than succeed. So after a while, especially after encouraging them so much, I was writing a lot of checks, and many of them I couldn't cash anymore. So I evolved my investing from being an angel investor to becoming a limited partner in 5 different venture funds right now, early stage funds. And as a limited partner, that means I'm an investor in the funds, and my colleagues in the funds, the general partners, go ahead and make those investment decisions. So now I refer my students, my friends, et cetera, to these early stage funds, and they then make those investment decisions. It also enables me to have a much bigger portfolio, knowing that 6 out of 10, 8 out of 10 startups are going to fail. And it's much easier to have a portfolio of funds than just make those investments myself. So I don't want to discourage anybody from being an angel investor or pursuing angel investors. Angel investors can be great investors, but that's my personal journey.
Fantastic. Now let's come to the conversations that, like, what were the traits, the conversations you had with founders and all people who do great things? What were the findings? What did you find? Like, what are the common things, common habits, common traits that they would all kind of share?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to bridge to that question with something that you asked just a little bit earlier, which was something, relating to growth.
Yes.
And, as we each think about the opportunities that we're presented with, and as we think about being a two-person startup or joining a growth stage startup or getting our two-person startup to growth stage, or we're in a larger company that maybe does corporate entrepreneurship or used to be a startup, there are different stages of growth that every company goes through. And it's a very personal decision as to how you want to engage in these different stages of growth. When I was first thinking about entrepreneurship in the kind of stepping back and looking at it, I always thought that the two or three people, kind of in the proverbial garage, iterating around products, coming up with design concepts, thinking, what if that was the essence of entrepreneurship. And it's exciting time. So there's that early stage where you're iterating, you're coming up with ideas, you're going through what we typically call the valley of death, right? Which is where many early stage startups die because they can't get that product market fit, because they can't raise the funding, because their team doesn't work. And then you kind of get to the second of these three stages, which is the growth stage. The growth stage is where once you've got a product that works, once you have customers that are starting to buy, you figure out how to scale it. You start selling more of it in your core market. You move into additional markets, whether they're geographic markets or ethnographic markets or demographic markets. You expand your product line, you get that fast growth. And then the third is once you've gotten that fast growth and you start to plateau, even the biggest companies like the Amazons and the Googles, their growth rates start to plateau. It's managing that growth and that enterprise. So you have that early startup stage, you have the fast growth stage, and then you have the kind of the management stage. So if you're going to break the life cycle of a startup venture into those three buckets, that's the way that I look at it. And of course, there's more startups than there are those big companies. But each of those big companies employs a lot more people. And I frame that because each of us has to figure out what we love doing as an entrepreneur every day. When we wake up, I say, I am ready to work 15 hours today, let's go do it, and what we're particularly good at. So I realized, as interesting and as exciting as I thought that early startup stage was, that there were people that I worked with that were better at it than I was. They were maybe had more insights around the marketplace. They were better at building products from scratch. They could stand up 3 or 4 demos very quickly. My area that I love doing, and it's also what I teach when we say, how do we start up and get through the valley of death, is once we figured out that early product market fit, how do we scale this business? That turned out to be where I love to engage. You run into new challenges every day. You're adding people, you're building teams, you're creating momentum. For me, that was kind of my special spot. And once we get to a certain level, it becomes less interesting for me again. And then I go back and find an early stage company or help start one up and do it again.
Fantastic. And you've written a book, the other F word. Could you tell us about that?
I have written a book. Of course, my publisher would kill me.
You've written a lot of books.
Yeah, John Wiley would kill me if I didn't say, hey, buy my book. My publisher makes way more money on every book than I do. But I wrote a book with a colleague of mine who teaches at Berkeley and Princeton. My colleague's name is John Danner. And our book is, hold on, this is an unashamed book pitch, right? Let me bring it in. The Other F Word, How Smart Leaders, Teams, and Entrepreneurs Put Failure to Work. It came out of the recognition that if you're going to launch a company, you have to be willing to fail along the way. The original title that we had for this book was something far more mainstream. It was something like The Inside Secrets of Great Silicon Valley Entrepreneurs. So sorry, there's a fly that seems to, that really wants some entrepreneurial vision here. The original title was The Inside Secrets of Great Silicon Valley Entrepreneurs. And we went out and we spoke to several hundred entrepreneurs and growth stage leaders and also leaders of big companies. We talked to people in other fields where innovation is required and kind of where people say failure is not an option, like astronauts or the producers of Broadway plays. And what we realized was the biggest inside secret of the best innovators was that they have a more productive relationship with failure. They figure out how to manage things when things don't go right. And that is a lot of it. Because as a startup math is pretty simple. The more change you want to drive, the more new things you have to try. The more new things you try, and the more ambitious and out there they are, the more likely it is that some of those aren't going to work. So therefore, you really want to make change happen. You want to launch a groundbreaking startup. Do you want to make big change happen inside your organization? You have to recognize that failure is just a natural byproduct, a natural dancing partner of this innovation that we seek so much. So that was the insight that gave rise to this book. And in this book, we dissected failure. We said, all right, we're going to focus on failure. And our publisher said, are you sure? Can we think we can sell a lot of books around this? We said, yes, we can. We will not fail, right? And we dissected failure and we identified 7 key stages that exist in what we call the failure value cycle. And I'll share them with you in just a moment. But even within those 7, we broke them into 3 periods: before failure happens, when it's happening, and afterwards. So if you think about this, because we all have setbacks, the product doesn't work, right? You're ready to run out of money. The customers complain, whatever it is. So here are our 7 stages. Before failure happens, we have to respect the fact that failure happens a lot. It happens all around us. We were talking earlier, right? That 6 to 8 out of 10 or more startups fail. So it's a natural element there. And then we have to rehearse for those failures as well. I mean, think about what great sports teams do. They practice all the time. Think about what military forces or police or firemen do. They practice all the time. They rehearse. So when something they didn't expect happens, they can respond really well. We don't rehearse for those failures in business. We don't run drills. Number 3, we have to recognize it early, which means we need those early warning systems and look for those early warning symptoms. Now, in some cases, we may be tracking our KPIs, right? Our key performance indicators, or we may have certain benchmarks we are attempting to hit. Well, let's track those carefully, because if they start to erode just a little bit, it might just be a blip, or it might be that all of a sudden we're on a different trajectory. So we look for those. So that's the pre-failure. And what we want to do is catch those failures early, and when they do hit, respond quickly so they don't become a big failure. Now, what happens when a failure does happen? Stage 4, you react quickly. You want to stop the bleeding, right? Everybody responds and says, here's what we're going to do to fix it. But then, so that's in the middle of it. And then afterward, in stage 5, a lot of people want to say, let's just get back to business again. But this is perhaps, for me, the most important stage. And we called it reflect. Why did that failure happen, right? What did we miss that gave rise to that failure? And can we fix it? Because if we just ignore why the failure happened, it'll happen again. So number 5, we reflect on that. And then number 6, we put those insights to work in a rebound strategy, right? And that's when we get active. And then number 7 is remember those failures so they don't happen again. So the 7 stages, see if I can get them in order for you. Respect that it happens a lot. Rehearse for those failures. Recognize them early. Then when a failure does happen, react quickly and in the moment. That's a C-level CEO's job. Number 4, number 5, reflect what went wrong. Number 6, rebound with authority. And number 7, remember. So, and if we have time, I'll share 1 or 2 great case studies too that we included in the book or other ones.
This is amazing. I love how you put it very succinctly. with all the arts, like respect that it's going to happen, that rehearse and recognize when it happens, react and then reflect and be ready for a rebound, and then remember. And so related to that, Mark, I know that a lot of times people will be talking about fail fast, failure is good, learn from failure. But when it really happens in some countries, in some cultures, in some companies, they don't really forgive. They say, no, it's okay, but you're the one who really messed up. Like, yeah.
Yeah, they don't forgive and they don't forget, right?
Yeah. So how do great companies deal with that? Like, we failed, but the one who made the servers all go down, right?
Yeah, that is such a big issue. And culturally, it varies quite a bit from region to region and country to country. And if you live in one of those countries where it's just not okay to fail, from a cultural standpoint that that's not there. One of the key ways to change that is to actually really share some case studies. And one of the key things, so let me think which order. I'll come back to a case study if we have time. I'll tell a Netflix story that is particularly interesting because Netflix is a company that most of us know. But a lot of it is understanding what is it in the DNA of great innovators and entrepreneurs that allows them to succeed in spite of these failures. And when you champion that, when you bring that out into the sunlight, it starts to make a big difference. So a couple of examples. Jack Ma, the founder and CEO of Alibaba, talks about this a lot because he must have failed, by his count, 20, 30 times. He tells a story of Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC, opened up in his home, in his hometown. 23 people or something like that went to get a job at KFC. Only one person didn't get the job, and that was him. And he had multiple failures. And being one of the most successful entrepreneurs in China, for him, being able to say, you have to persevere, you have to learn what you're good at, you understand, you gain insights if you're resilient through those failures, helps change people's mindset around that. One more story. I was meeting with a group of delegates from the European Union Parliament, and they were talking about how they wanted to accelerate the startup ecosystem across Europe in the European Union. And I asked them, I said, that's great, we all want startups. I said, what happens if a startup fails? And this was in a particular country. They go, oh, well, the entrepreneur needs to pay all of the employees for 2 years. And, there's a host of regulations and it's really hard to shut down a company. And I said, well, you realize that you have to make it easier to shut companies down if they fail. And they go, no. We just want people to start them up. We want the jobs. We don't want them to shut them down. And I said, well, I understand. But if you make it so hard to shut down a company and it becomes so expensive and difficult, then it means people are not going to start them up in the first place. So you're taxing failure. And they go, yeah, but we want the startups. Anyway, we had this circular conversation until one of them finally said, oh, I get it. If we penalize them so much to shut them down, or if they fail, then they won't start them up. We said, yes. So they started changing the regulations. And if you change the regulations, that can start to change the mindset as well.
Fantastic. I think this relates very well with the conversation I was having. Currently, I'm in Cape Town, South Africa. Last week, I was in Rwanda, and we were having those type of conversations around that if they're in some of the Rwanda is great, by the way, like Mauritius, Rwanda, very easy to run businesses. South Africa, Zambia as well. And then a lot of countries are trying to make it easy to start businesses, but you still find a lot of countries that make it really difficult, that when somebody fails, really penalized. And then also startups that if you hire wrongly, for instance, like it's very hard to get rid of somebody. And now you have to keep paying people who are not performing with the money you don't have, it took a long time. And then as a result, even when they're saying that we want to create jobs, entrepreneurs to create jobs, instead the entrepreneurs resort to just getting people from Upwork and Fiverr, because now it's easy to just move as opposed to
Right.
hiring people locally.
Well, no, that's exactly right. And that's one of the reasons there are a number of things when we talk about entrepreneurial ecosystems like Silicon Valley that talk to exactly that. It's one of the reasons why Silicon Valley has evolved over the last somewhat close to 80 years into this granddaddy of the entrepreneurial ecosystems. Now, we're seeing lots of other great entrepreneurial ecosystems pop up, but there are a number of key elements that exist inside Silicon Valley and inside all strong ecosystems that you have to take into account. And one of them is what you just talked about. And what I was talking about with the European Union, and that is you have to have regulations that make it easy to start up businesses, that make it easy to hire people and fire people if they don't work out. In fact, one of the elements that's really important in a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem is this mobility of labor. It also means that you have to have good laws around confidentiality, intellectual property, all of those. So the regulatory and legal environment needs to be set up properly to encourage business creation and business evolution. And that's just one. This is an area that I've studied at Berkeley quite a bit. We can talk about the need for great human capital. So you need good institutions, which is great because UC Berkeley, Stanford, and other institutions in the Silicon Valley, San Francisco Bay Area help that. You need access to capital. Not always as much as we have in Silicon Valley. I think we have a little bit too much, but you need access to capital. You need that right entrepreneurial mindset, which we've talked about. And you need kind of this infrastructure of incubators and accelerators and lawyers and advisors and investment bankers and lots of people that work with many startups to help them grow. So there are these elements, these key pillars of entrepreneurial ecosystems that you look for. And if we're looking, and if anybody here is a leader, government, policymaker, whatever, you want to think about what those key policy elements are to drive all of those pillars. And if you have one or two areas that are weak, then you say, aha, what can I do to fill that in? And that becomes really helpful in spurring this kind of entrepreneurial activity that we want that continues to feed upon itself, right? That spins up.
Great. Okay. So everybody who is listening now, you can type your questions for Professor Mark Coopersmith in the chat box, and we'll get him to answer some of them. So for me, Mark, it's around what you touched on now around capital. So the first time I've been to Silicon Valley a few times now, but the first time I went there, I was speaking at the Startup Grind conference, and where Guy Kawasaki spoke and Clayton Christensen spoke and all of that.
Right.
But the late Professor Clay Christensen talked about like the innovation cycle, different types of innovation, but the cycle around money in terms of when big companies, entrepreneurs make money and then they don't know what to do with it, essentially, right? Just paraphrasing a little bit. Then they give it to the banker. The banker doesn't know what to do with the money, gives it to the investment banker. The investment banker doesn't know what to do with the money and give it to the VCs, And then the VCs don't know what to do with it. They give it to the entrepreneurs again, right?
And there we go. That's my cycle right there, right? I've gone back and like, I'm not, it's like so this happens a lot. So I'm going to just break in. That's perfect. I mean, this happens a lot. And there's kind of a famous example, and it's called the PayPal Mafia. And the PayPal Mafia, they're called that, right? Because PayPal was an early unicorn exit. It was a payments platform. Now they have Venmo and others in Silicon Valley. It was bought by eBay. And the original founding team made a lot of money. And what they did after that is once they sold the company, they eventually left and they all started up all these other companies. And what did they do with their money? Well, they started up other companies like Elon Musk came out of PayPal. Reid Hoffman, who is the founder of LinkedIn, came out of PayPal. The founders of Yelp came out of PayPal. I mean, you keep going. Yes, founders of Stripe came out of PayPal, right?
Steve Chen, chat early, like all of those people. Yeah.
500 startups, Dave McClure. That was all, those guys were all there. So what did they do? They support one another. They sit on each other's boards. They invest in one another. So Now there's talk of a new one called the Uber Mafia, right? I mean, I don't always know that mafia is the language that we want to use, right? The family kind of thing, but they operate like family, right? This is a benevolent mafia. They support one another. So they create their own entrepreneurial ecosystems, help one another out, invest in one another, send deals to one another. Um, so what you want to do is create these communities that are really robust like this, right? You spin them up, and then, and you've been to Silicon Valley, of course, and other hotspots around the world. And, COVID is different, but with pre and post COVID, every night there are hundreds of activities and events and meetups and demo days and everything like that, where we have all of these creative collisions, which is really fantastic.
Absolutely. I've seen that, like, where initially when I went to Google, I bought the Google shirt. And when I wore it in there, everybody's like, do you work for Google? Do you work for Google? Because there people wear company t-shirts and hoodies, like they're proud.
Yeah.
With that. And their demo days, their pitch meetings on Sand Hill Road, you're like, a lot of things happening. Now, on the question of money, how do we deal with failure where there isn't a lot of capital? Because I know they, like in Silicon Valley, you have like employee number 1 to employee number 100 of a company, they're all multimillionaires, and then they could invest in a lot of things and could, as angels or VCs or all of that. And then in the case of like Africa, where we have very few people then that know how to raise money. Yeah. And then if they do, then if they fail, it's a lot harder. And people then are afraid to even spend the money that they raised because how do you deal with that?
No, that's a great question. And the way to, one of the things you can do would be, which I always recommend for entrepreneurs from different regions around the world, is to say, aha, do you see patterns in other markets where you may want to replicate those? But you're at a different stage. So let's say we were to say, what are suggestions for creating this kind of more robust funding environment and entrepreneurial ecosystem? You might say in Africa, or you might say in 2 or 3 hubs in Africa. It's really important to create a critical mass. If you're dispersed, if you're spread out too thinly, then you don't get those creative collisions. It's harder to create the relationships. Even though capital is just money and I can wire it from me to you just as quickly as I can give it to my neighbor next door, we typically like to invest closer to home. There was one of my former students is working on a venture I think is really fascinating. And I shared it with one of the funds I'm in, and they go, this seems really interesting, but this guy's in Europe and we're domestic and we don't do international. Now, some people do, but so here are several thoughts on that. Number 1, take a look at places. It's easy for me. I mean, I've spent time in lots of entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world, including, Berlin. Paris is becoming much better. London. We can, take a look at what's happening in places in the Middle East with Tel Aviv and elsewhere. And there are some entrepreneurial hotspots that are starting to gain, temperature, that are heating up in Africa as well. And you know those better than I. But what is it about ones that have become successful that we can replicate? And I wouldn't look to Silicon Valley per se, a lot of people do, for the path, but I would look to what's there, those 6 key pillars of entrepreneurial ecosystems that I shared, human capital and funding and, the right kinds of mindset and the infrastructure and all of that. So that's one. The other thing is to say, what is it that we are missing in this regard? So you talked about capital. Now, capital is starting to flow across Africa as well. And capital won't flow into a marketplace from outside that market, if you want to attract foreign capital, until we start to see a return on those early investments. Right, until we see a return on capital. So when we start to get exits, when we have a few unicorns, when we have some successful smaller exits, and people are seeing the type of venture returns that they're used to, then capital will start to flow. And the capital is going to flow into those companies and countries and regions where we're seeing the best outcomes. And as a result of it, those places, since the entrepreneurs will often flow to where the capital has flown and vice versa, will start to become the entrepreneurial hotspots. So one of the key things from a policy standpoint and an entrepreneurial standpoint would be to say, how can we accelerate some of these exits? How can investors get a 10x or a 20x on their investment? And what works in our region, country, whatever. And then once we do that, we'll start to accelerate the flows of capital, the rate of new venture creation. The other thing is, once you start to have some successes, then a few failures are okay. Because if you talk to an investor and say, I failed early, but this is what I learned, and I would like to put this to work. Oftentimes, if they feel there's the potential for good outcomes, if the tide is rising, they'll reinvest in you and give you a second shot. One more thought. We often talk about the importance of capital. It is absolutely important to accelerate high growth businesses. But there can also be too much money. Right now, there is a huge amount of money. This last year and each of the last few quarters have all been record breaking in the amount of money raised and invested. But sometimes you can raise too much capital. You can get too big, too fast. And when you do that, when you crash bigger and harder. So using those core entrepreneurial practices of going out and getting product market fit, figuring out a scalable business and business model, figuring out a repeatable go-to-market plan, figuring out how you'll move from your core marketplace into secondary markets. All of those elements are crucial before you start raising and spending too much cash.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for all of this. And I know that there's a lot of content and a lot of things we could really touch on. I'll get some questions and then we'll get
perfect. There are two things. There are two things that I want to touch on quickly, because one of them I'd like to offer, and that is, if anybody's interested in at least getting a free excerpt, and it's a pretty big excerpt, it's like the first 50 pages of my book, you can do that if you just go to my website, markcoopersmith.com. And there's a link there. Put in your email address, which means you may find yourself getting the occasional every 6 months email from me, just, hey, here's what's going on. But we'll go ahead and get you the first 5 or 6 chapters for free of the other F word. And there's a few other things that are on my site that you can look around and you might find interesting as well. So that's a free offer. And secondly, I had mentioned a case study, a Netflix case study about learning from failure that I thought I would share, and then let's open it up. And we're going to go back a few years. And Reed Hastings and his team at Netflix, you may be familiar or may not. Netflix, when it started here in America, started out as mailing DVDs through the mail. We used to have the big VHS cassettes and all of that we would go down to the local video store. And then DVDs came out, and they were able to mail it through the first class mail. So the first thing that Netflix was about was you would put the movies you wanted on a list online, and then they would send it to you. You would watch it on your DVD player and send it back. And eventually, of course, Netflix started to begin streaming videos, which is the core of their business right now, although they still do send DVDs by mail. And at a certain point, a number of years ago, they decided they were going to split these two services, because for a while, you could stream a few elements of content, and they were mostly streaming studio content, Disney movies, TV shows, things like that they bought from other people. So you could get those on Netflix and you could get your DVDs. So they decided to split the service, and they split it into Netflix became streamed movies, right? Flicks on the net. And then they had a new service they came up with, they called Quickster. Quickster, kind of a bad name, but it was, we'll get you your DVDs quickly. They split it in half, and if you wanted them both, now you had to pay 2 monthly fees and manage 2 accounts. Well, you can imagine what happened. The customers hated it. Netflix shares went down 75% in just a few months because all the customers were leaving. So Netflix was almost acquired by a Disney or whomever else, 75% in just a few months. So huge failure, and they inflicted it upon themselves. So what did they do? Well, the first thing they did, they realized they had a big problem. They reacted by sending out a video and apologized to all of their customers and said, please give us a chance, come back. And interestingly enough, just apologizing, the customers at least stopped leaving. And then in the reflect stage, they said, why was it so easy for all of our customers to leave? And they realized they were just streaming other people's content. So that was the impetus for them to begin creating their own content. Things like House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. And of course, now Netflix spends more on new content than any Hollywood studio does. So their big aha from that failure is, we need our own content that they can only get on Netflix. And that's how they turned failure from an almost critical event for the company, terminal, end of story, to helping it become one of the most valuable companies in the world.
Fantastic. And Netflix is really growing really big, including like all around the world, obviously, but including here in Africa. And of course, the biggest one right now, the series from Korea, Squid Game.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, it's on my list. It's like I haven't watched it yet. Have you watched Squid Game yet?
Yes, finished it.
Yeah.
Like binge watched it. Great. There's a question from Terry Kaplan saying, you said 6 out of 10 startups fail. What do you think is the most common reason why that is the case?
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons why startups fail, but I think the most common reason, there's 2 or 3, but I would say the most common reason, the one that we really focus a lot on, is that the product that you're offering is not a product that your customers want or are willing to pay for. So, I shared my personal example earlier about I built an e-commerce solution because I needed it. Well, it turned out there were a lot of people like me that needed an e-commerce solution just like that. So I was successful. But if I'd had really unique needs and I built that and tried to spin it out, probably would have failed. So that concept of product market fit, and what that means from an entrepreneur standpoint, and many of you have probably studied this, is this concept of customer discovery is so important. It's not market research, it's customer discovery. It's going out and really understanding your customers and the problems that they have. Right? The other companies that came to me had the same problem I did, which was they didn't like the e-commerce solutions. It didn't meet their needs. So one of the first ones is that you're building a product that you had an idea for a product, but you thought about the solution before you went out and validated the problem. Now, once you've validated the problem, the next challenge, of course, is can you actually build a good solution and offer it at a price that people are willing to pay? So that's the execution piece. Another reason startups frequently fail is the team just doesn't execute very well. There are 4 risks that venture capitalists, 4, maybe 5, key buckets of risk that we look at that are key reasons startups fail. One of them is customer risk, right, or market risk, and that is the customers won't buy the product. Another one is financial risk, right? We can't make the money work, or we need too much money to start up. Another one is execution risk, right, which is around team. So those types of things. Can the team execute? So it's always great if you can put a team together where some of the members on the team have worked together before. As an investor, that's one thing I look for quite a bit. Another one might be regulatory risk or legal risk, right? Are you in a marketplace that is regulated, and can you get the approvals that are necessary? So those are some of the key areas that we look at as investors why startups fail, and as entrepreneurs, because I wear both hats, where we say, aha, let's address this upfront.
Fantastic. What would be your words now, to just words of encouragement, and any other words that you'd like to share with entrepreneurs from across Africa? Like, what would you, what do you think need to hear?
We'll come back. Yeah. Let me come back to kind of where we started, what I'm passionate about, which is making positive change happen. And if you're going to make positive change happen in your community, right, and positive change kind of in every way, for me, it's kind of a simple equation because it starts by looking at yourself, right? What are you passionate about? What are your values about? If you can launch a business, some people say that's overrated. I don't agree. I think that every day I love what I do now, right? In addition to my investing and helping startups and stuff and being able to talk about it. Every day I wake up and I say, this is what I'm passionate about. I want to spread the word. I want to make entrepreneurs better entrepreneurs. So first, what are you passionate about and what do you love doing and what are your values? Second, what are you good at, right? Even if you're passionate about something, if you're crappy at it, chances are you're not going to execute very well. So what are you good at and what kind of a team can you assemble that is really good at this, better than your competition? And then third, where's the big opportunity? And we were just talking about how do you test the opportunity, right? How do you get that product market fit? How do you determine if there's a good strategy to go from a few customers to more customers to more customers? So for me, it's that intersection of passion and values, expertise, and a big and growing market opportunity. Just from, if you're looking for a compass, kind of what's your North Star?
Fantastic. And that ties in very well, similar to the Ikigai framework. And I really love that. And I think one of the reasons I thought of inviting you is that I really connected with your message and what you do. I'm an educator as well. I love what I'm doing and working with entrepreneurs, and we're investing as Enigma Ventures, but also teaching. So learning and teaching and practicing all of that. And also something which really resonated with me was how at UC Berkeley, they have entrepreneurs teaching entrepreneurship, which is different in a lot of universities where you say, okay, you have just somebody teaching entrepreneurship. They haven't built anything. They have not experienced anything. So what they're teaching tends to be a little bit more theoretical. Right. And then entrepreneurs then don't know what to do still. Like on Monday, what do I do?
Yeah. So, I mean, hopefully, I mean, in our conversation, and many of my colleagues are just like me, we've done it. We've done it for 20 years, 30 years, more. We invest in companies. We've crashed and burned a couple. We know what to avoid. So, Sandras, can I speed through the chat and give 30-second answers to a few of these questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was more concerned about your time.
No, that's fine. I will need to step out in a few minutes, but let me do this. As a startup, how do you suggest we hire a CEO? The co-founders are more ops and product focused, but we were told we need a CEO. So the key thing, make sure that you have the right functions on a team first and foremost. Every company startup needs a minimum of two functions, the hackers and the hustlers. Right? The hackers build products, whether it's code or whether it's manufacturing, whatever else it is. And the hustlers are the ones that will go out and sell it. Now, you do need somebody that has that right kind of experience in scaling a venture. But I would say, to the extent that you're still working on that early product market fit, just hack your way and hustle your way to get some market success. Once you start to see some of that early market success, then you may find that CEO a little bit more organically. It may come through an investor. It may come through people that you meet as you're going through this process. The key thing is to get out there, meet lots and lots of people, and find people who are passionate about what you do in the way you are, and those conversations will hopefully happen. Sometimes they don't happen as naturally, but that would be my first set of recommendations. Next, 6 out of 10 sales. What are common reasons? We just shared some of those. Partnership, success. Keep up with your... So partnership. I've been really fortunate. In most of my startups and other ventures, I have managed to find great partners. And in my partners, sometimes we're even partners. Sometimes I've even stepped back. And even though I'm used to potentially being the lead dog on the sled, I've stepped back and said, you be a partner. I'm just going to manage this. The important thing with a partnership is that you're aligned on what your ultimate objectives are. Your skills maybe overlap, but are complementary to one another. And that you have a mechanism when you don't agree as to how you can come out the other end better. And if it's constantly stormy, I find that challenging. You know, in the model of teams, you think about Bruce Tuckman's model of teams, here is an academic framework. You form, then you storm, then you build norms, and then you perform, right? Form, storm, norm, perform. We go through that storming phase with new people on our team, and we have to get to norm. And if we can't ever get to that norming stage, then the partnership won't work. I've seen so many ventures fall apart because of dysfunctional partnerships in the company and also dysfunctional boards of directors. So use those mechanisms to try and drive alignment around that. This was another reason, by the way, where you can to recruit people, not everybody that you've worked with before, but to have people on your team that have worked with one another, because those teams often work better together. Starting to employ, there we are, let's see. Currency risk. That's above my pay grade. Good luck with that. Banks. Banks are not an option. That is correct. I'm just going through. Banks don't work with startups. The only reason to have a bank is to have a checking account, right? The money that they offer you is debt, not equity. When you're a startup, you are too risky for a bank to lend to. The only way a bank will lend to you is if you have lots of inventory, and then they'll only give you like 50% of the value of your inventory. Now, that might be enough, but banks are not an option. You need to find sources of equity to grow your venture. That's why it's called venture capital, not debt. Last question from you, Sandras, or the team?
Great. I think for me, it will just be, what are the names of the VCs that you are LP on, and what types of startups do they invest in? All types of businesses generally, yeah. And which
so the easiest way to see this, first of all, I will say, unfortunately, I didn't share that story to be preemptive. Unfortunately, most invest domestically in Silicon Valley. Okay. But you can see the list of the VCs I'm a partner and a limited partner on my LinkedIn website. They are B Partners, Javelin, Strawberry Creek Ventures, and our UC Berkeley SkyDeck fund. And I'm in a couple of funds on one or two of those. You can see that on LinkedIn. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, Mark Coopersmith, let me know that Sandra sent you and that you joined this. So I'll know where it came from. And then you can take a look. My funds are all listed there. And if you think some are potentially a great fit, go to their websites. They tell you the stage they're looking at, mostly early, the sectors they invest in, what they look for in founders, what stage they're looking at, all of those things. They lay that out because they don't want to screen deals that aren't a good fit. They don't have the time for that either. And you don't want to spend your time, waste your time, trying to pitch a VC that's never going to give you an investment.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we actually receive opportunities from SkyDeck. So they do send, when they are looking for startups from other regions from Africa, they let us know and we share within the Pranary network. So it's really good. Thank you very much, Professor Mark Coopersmith, for sharing your expertise, your experience, and really what you put together in a very clear manner. And thank you very much. Really appreciate this. It's been a great session.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I see a couple questions to share, some LinkedIn or others. If you just Google me, you'll find my website. And if you Google me with LinkedIn, you'll find my LinkedIn site and just reach out to me. Sandras is linked to me. So if you're linked to Sandras, which you should be, right? And Sandras is linked to me, then you should be able to find me no problem. Sandras, it's a way for you to punch up your LinkedIn connections as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So with everybody, we make all these opportunities available to you. Just reach out on Pranary, and then that way you learn the different people that we have, the different guests, the different mentors, the different investors and opportunities that we have. That way we can also funnel the right opportunities along to save you time and also save our investors time. But Pranary is that place where we're bringing together all the great game changers in Africa So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Mark, for being really generous.
No, thank you. It was really a pleasure. Borrow my mantra. By the way, great entrepreneurs borrow. In fact, it's sometimes said that if you borrow from one person, it's considered plagiarism and copying. But if you borrow from many people, that's considered research. So borrow liberally, research liberally, and kind of my mantra, right? Create positive change every day. Everybody, have a great day.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. It's really been great. Those of you who are here for the first time, you can go to pranary.com. I'll share the link in the chat box, and you get to know about our different events. And then when we'll have Professor Mark Coopersmith again to share another piece of, and to share insights on a different topic. So thank you very much. It's been great. Type 1 for Professor Mark Coopersmith, and then also share your biggest learning in the chat box. Just type your biggest learning in the chat box. We want to know, like, what was the key takeaway for you in the chat box? That'd be so cool. We appreciate that. Take some time to just read that out, and we'd love to just know. Daisy, all the R's, Pamela Butelezi, failure value cycle. Great. Excellent. So good to see so many people here. So investor material from Letitia. So thanks, Abdullahi, for coming through, and good to see you. Atu, great. Thanks for joining us. Atu Padalka, Clayton Bond. You know, Atu is doing great work in Durban, which is really cool. And Anne is in our program. She's building a device that detects blood clots. Really good. Clayton Bond, good to see you and having you here. Daisy Iron, it's good to have you here. Daisy is in one of our programs. Emma Kua, great to see you. Engineer Bonfest, great to have you. Jean-Marie Boemo, welcome. Good to see you. John Kaumba, thanks for joining us. Letitia, Lebo, Pachel, oh, great. Good to see the Lebo was also in our programs. Linda Yombi, Chitomali, we were in class together with Linda. We did computer science together at Copperbelt University. And she's a great entrepreneur who runs a successful cleaning company in Zambia. Really good. Mbolo Moto, great. Thanks for joining us today. Marie, I think this is Marie Behrens from Kipepeo in Mauritius. And Marie attended Pranary, that time we called Startup Circles, and she raised money. Well done. Marina Tokozi, Sajvari, Ndaba, Nina, thank you for joining everybody. And Dalumbu, Christy from our Pranary team, thank you. Noni Dishego, good to see you. Oliver Mkenani, Oliver from Lusaka, Zambia. And Zona, Pamela Butelezi, great to see you. Rob Ashley, Samir Omar from the ShowPride Tassel campaign, now in Ignition Pranary, good to see you. Solomon, welcome, good to see you. Tabello Tutu, thank you very much. Great. Clayton, oh yeah, this is Clayton from Terry from Connect to Care. Awesome, great company. Connect to Care is a great company. Great, thank you very much. Ndaba, thanks for sharing your biggest takeaway. Great, awesome. Thank you very much, everybody.